Croeso, welcome everyone to this short webinar, which is being run as part of a series of events promoted by the NHS Wales e-Library for Health in support of International Open Access Week. Happy International Open Access Week, everyone. My name is Rhys. I'm a librarian based at Morriston Hospital in Swansea Bay University Health Board. And in this session this morning, we're going to look at some tips that will hopefully help you when deciding where to publish your research paper. So here's a very brief outline of our session today. We're going to start by looking at the kinds of journals that we definitely don't want to publish our work in, and that's predatory journals. So we'll talk a little bit about exactly what predatory journals are, discuss some of the typical characteristics of predatory journals so that we can spot them and avoid them like the plague. We'll then go on to look at some of the things that we need to consider when choosing the right journal for our research, and that can include things like making sure the aims and the scope of any potential journal is closely aligned with our research paper. Also thinking about the visibility of the journal. Is it indexed in a bibliographic database like Medline, Embase or sy'n, for instance? There are some really useful, quite advanced online resources that can help us to identify suitable journal titles. Two of which I'll attempt to demo this morning are the Journal Author Name Estimator, which is also known as Jane. The second is the Journal Targeter tool, which is produced by Yale and is also known as JOT. Both are search engines that will recommend journal titles for your research. In terms of the searching functionality, they are quite similar. In fact, JOT actually uses the search features of Jane, but presents the results in a different way. So I think it'd be interesting for you to see both so you can get an idea of what they do and the type of information that they can give you. We'll then finish with a demonstration of how we can use a citation database, Scopus. It's freely available for all NHS Wales staff and students to use via the NHS Wales e-Library for Health. So we'll use that to search for potential journal titles at the end. So some points to mention right at the start. As part of our day-to-day jobs as librarians, we're sometimes asked by researchers to recommend suitable journal titles. When this happens, we tend to find that it's at the very end of a project, after the first draft of a manuscript has been written. I think that's a mistake, and you should really consider where you're going to publish your research at the very start of your project, as opposed to the very end. And the key reason for this is that you really need to decide early on whether you're going to publish your work as open access or not. And of course, this is Open Access Week, and we strongly encourage everyone, wherever possible, to publish their work as open access. And there's many good reasons for this. It gives instant access to those who need it without any charge. It helps with the dissemination of knowledge into countries that can't necessarily afford subscription charges, and also the wider general public as well, who wouldn't normally have access to the evidence. Open access makes research more visible by not keeping it behind paywalls. And for you as a researcher, the evidence shows that articles that are published as open access tend to have greater visibility and a greater impact. And if you're interested in finding out more about open access, my colleague Jessica Blackburn-Smith at the NHS Wales e-Library gave a fantastic presentation earlier in the week entitled "What is Open Access?" And I've put the link to the recording on the resources slide at the end of my slide deck, which we'll share at the end. If you missed it, strongly encourage you to go and take a look at that. If you are looking to publish your research as open access, then you will need to publish in a journal that supports this. A good place to start is the Sherpa Romeo database, which presents journal open access policies from around the world. Publishing open access can shift the costs of publishing from the reader to the writer. So some open access journals will come with article processing charges, or APCs, and it's important that you're aware of these potential costs right at the start of any research project so that you can build it into any potential funding bids. And Jess explains this in greater detail in her presentation, but not all open access publishing involves an article processing charge. There are green and diamond models that do not involve these charges, but it's important that you're aware of all this right at the start of your project so you can make your decisions accordingly. And the best way to do this is to identify potential journal titles as early as possible. Another practical tip then is to make a list or spreadsheet at the start of your project, as many as 5 or 6 potential journals where you can submit your manuscript. Your chances of being accepted can be as high as 1 in 20 for some of the big journal titles. So it's a good idea to have several options. Select your first choice, draft your manuscript accordingly, using the guidance for authors and the referencing style for that particular journal. And then if your paper is rejected for whatever reason, and this is very common, don't be put off by this, you'll have more options. But as I said, Sherpa Romeo is a really good place to start looking at open access journals. So I'll just bear with me while I change screens and I'll give you a quick demo of the Sherpa Romeo database. So this is the Sherpa Romeo database. Somebody I was working with recently published their work in a journal entitled Injury. So I'll just use that as my example. So yeah, so it gives us lots of useful information here about the journal title Injury. So I can see that it's published by Elsevier, so one of the major medical publishers. There are lots of different pathways associated with this journal title for the accepted, submitted versions of the manuscript. If I hit the drop down here, I can see, for instance, that if I'm publishing my work with this particular pathway and Injury, that there would be open access fees associated with it. But I can also see that, yes, this title is open access publishing. There's no embargo, so the work wouldn't be behind a paywall for any period of time. It gives me information about the copyright license, which can be shared for non-commercial purposes. But again, if you're interested in finding out more about copyright licensing, I strongly encourage you to watch Jess's talk from earlier in the week. And it actually lists, which is quite useful, the repositories in which the work can be stored and any conditions that it must be adhered to when citing the work. So lots of information there. Another thing I like about Sherpa, which I think might be useful for you to see, is that it actually links to the publisher's website. I'll just show you quickly, as there's a few things here that we're going to want to think about when choosing where to publish. So as I mentioned, Injury is an Elsevier journal. It tells me over here what the impact factor is for this particular journal. So that's how many times an article is typically cited. There's a guidance for authors section. We can just see it here, the guide for authors section, which you're going to want to look at. It'll tell you how the manuscript should be formatted and referenced. The link to submit your work, obviously, when the time comes, and more information down here about the submission process. So you can see what the article processing charges, as well as the turnaround time and how long peer review is likely to take. But all publishers will display this information in a slightly different way on their websites, but that's the sort of information that you can expect to find on a legitimate publisher's website, which leads us nicely on to predatory publishing. So bear with me again while I just change my screens. So before we look at where we want to publish, let's look at where we definitely don't want to publish, and that is predatory journals. And predatory journals are those which charge publication fees and fail to provide any editorial or publishing services that are associated with legitimate publishers. Predatory journals will often publish papers without checking them for quality or legitimacy, have limited or no peer review process, and will often use unscrupulous or aggressive methods to trick authors into submitting articles to them. Unfortunately, predatory journals can look just like any other journal, but thankfully there are some ways to spot them and look out for them. So some things to think about. The primary goal for any predatory journal is to make money, so no regard is given to the quality of the articles. So have a look at articles previously published. You may find some of them are out of scope or nonsense articles, and that can be a giveaway. It may list unofficial impact factors on its website. Again, check the website. Is there an editorial board listed? Are its members prominent in the field of study? Databases, really important one. Is it indexed in a database like Medline or Synnel? Are healthcare professionals going to be able to find your research? Another big giveaway is they can have quite an aggressive approach, often soliciting researchers through email. If you have an email claiming to be from a journal editor that you don't know, from a journal that you've never heard of, asking you to submit a research paper, then that's usually a real red flag. Does the publisher have contact details on its website, and does it explain the peer review process? So all important things to think about when deciding if a journal is legitimate or not. There's a really good resource out there for helping you to avoid predatory journals, and it's the Think, Check, Submit website. It contains a really detailed checklist that you can use to help you when assessing whether or not a publisher is suitable for your research. So how do we go about actually choosing the right journal? It's a good idea to identify a suitable journal or selection of journals, as you said, before you even put pen to paper. First thing to look at is the aim and scope of the journal. Does your article match its intended focus? Does the journal accept the type of paper you intend to write and submit? Think about what is the target audience or readership of the journal, and does that all align with your paper? It's definitely a good idea to read a selection of papers from any journal you intend to publish in, just to get a feel for the types of papers they publish and how they format their articles. And the NHS Wales e-library has a huge range of journal titles available for all NHS Wales staff and students to access. So there's a good chance that you'll be able to access any potential journal you intend to publish in through the e-library website or the NHS Wales Library Search Catalogue. And again, I'll link to those resources on the last slide. Is the journal considered prestigious in its field? So talk to colleagues. Have they heard of it? Is it well known? Consider the impact factor, but don't choose a journal simply because it has a higher impact factor. Talking to researchers, it's often a myth that librarians are trying to dispel when researchers think publishing in a higher impact factor journal is always better. That's simply not the case. A journal impact factor isn't necessarily a reliable measure of quality. It's measured on the number of citations the article it publishes receives. So a paper may receive a lot of attention, citations for the wrong reasons as well as good reasons. Example we typically use, if you think of the Andrew Wakefield study that linked the MMR vaccine with autism, and that paper was published in the Lancet. That had lots of citations, would have increased the Lancet's impact factor, but obviously that was a deeply flawed study. But not only that, it's more important that you publish your journal, your work in a journal that's the best fit for your subject and requirements. For example, if you're producing practice guidelines that would be of specific interest to speech and language therapists, for instance, then it would be more important to have that research published in a journal that is read by speech and language therapists and that they can access, rather than publish in a journal just because it has a high impact factor, like Nature, for instance. And some practical things you might want to consider: how long does the peer review process take? What is the publication frequency of the journal? And what is the acceptance rate of the journal? So let's look at some resources then that can help us choose the right journal. The first thing I wanted to mention is that the publishers themselves will offer guidance and information for authors on how to choose the right journal. And I've included some of the major healthcare publishers there, BMJ, Wiley and Elsevier, that have pages on their websites for authors to help you to choose journals. I won't actually go into those pages now, but I just wanted to make you aware that they do exist and that they do have some useful information on there. Two online resources that I found useful in the past when recommending potential journal titles are Jane and Jot. Sounds a little bit like a children's TV program when I say the names together, but Jane is the journal author name estimator created by the Biosemantics group based in Erasmus University. It's a free online bibliographic journal selection tool. Amazingly, it's been around since 2007, but I only came across it a couple of years ago. It allows users to easily input data into an open text box using keywords and search for the most relevant journal titles. Jane searches the PubMed database using an open source search engine for the 50 most relevant results based on the search query. And for authors who are concerned about privacy and confidentiality of their work, Jane does not store any of the data on the server. And the second tool is Jot, which is produced by Yale in the States. Very similar to Jane, actually uses the search functionality of Jane, but presents the results in a different way. So let's have a quick look how these both work in practice. So this is Jane. So as you can see, you've got this search box in the middle of the screen, and you can pop in the name of your, the title of your research, or even paste the abstract in, or simply use keywords. A project I was working on recently where we used Jane to recommend suitable journal titles was about plantar fasciitis. So I'll use that as our example. So I'm just going to pop plantar fasciitis there. Just to make you aware, there's a show extra options button here. So if you just wanted to search for journals that were in a particular language, or journals that were open access only or closed access only, search for journals with a specific publication type, you have the options to do that there. But when I search, if I hit the Find Journals button, it's going to give me a table of recommended journals, ranking them in order of most to least relevant. It has its own metric or algorithm for calculating impact here, and it tells you exactly how that's calculated if you click the question mark button there. But it actually ranks in order the journals, tells me if they're Medline indexed, which is really useful. And if I scroll down, I've got the option to export as well, which is pretty useful. As I say, if we're trying to make a list of journals and we're using reference management software, we can export the journal titles into that. So that's Jane. I'll quickly go and show you Jot now, and we'll use the same example. So again, you can search using title or abstract. You can actually import references as well. So if you find similar references to your research, you can actually upload them and use them to jot to recommend you article journal titles as well. But I'm just going to pop in plantar fasciitis again. I think I need to put something, a search query in the title and the abstract part. And we can see that JOT presents a nice visual graph of the results. So here, the prospect is how likely JOT's algorithm thinks the paper is to be accepted. So actually on this occasion, this was the journal we submitted to, and it was the American Podiatric Medical Association. So it was right in this instance. So the prospect is down here, and it also measures against site score, which is another journal metric like an impact factor. So we can see here that the journal of pain or the transactions of biomedical engineering have been suggested as potential titles, but there's a much lower prospect according to JOT of them being accepted. So JOT defines open access journals in this case as any journals listed in the directory of open access journals. But some journals not listed there, defined as closed here, may still have open access pathways. So you should always check Sherpa Romeo for details. But here you can see red is open and the blue is closed journals. So that's Jane and Jot. I'll just go back to our slides quickly. So actually we can move on to Scopus now. So I'll show you the Scopus database. So we'll have a quick demonstration of Scopus and how we can use that to search for journal titles. But the best way to access Scopus is through the eLibrary website. So I'll just move us over to the eLibrary website. So here we are. And if we select the databases option, we'll see a list of databases, all in alphabetical order, all completely free for NHS Wales staff and students to use. So if I scroll down to S, I can see Scopus is here, and I'm just going to click the link through to Scopus. Just to let you know, I'm using the NHS Wales network this morning. So it's not asking me to sign in. But if you're using your own laptop or computer at home, it may ask you to sign in with your NHS email address and password. So Scopus won't recommend journals to us in the same way that Jane just did. But we can look at impact scores of specific journal titles that we may be interested in submitting our research to. Obviously, we've already talked about the dangers of using impact factor alone when making our decisions about where to publish, but it's still very useful to know this information to help us make informed decisions about where to publish. And just to say, Dr. Alison Wheatman from the Shoa unit in Cardiff University will be running a session on how to use Scopus to perform citation searching this afternoon. So we'll go into Scopus in a lot more detail there. But if we just look at the sources option, it tells us that currently there are over 46,000 journal titles currently indexed in Scopus. And we can use the filter option on the left-hand side. So if we only wanted to see open access journals, for instance, I can click that and apply. And it's going to show me the open access titles that are indexed in Scopus. And just something that's quite useful that you don't get the option to do in Sherpa Romeo, for instance, is that you can narrow it down to subject area. So if I just scroll down here, I believe medicine is a subject area. And if I was interested in journal titles in orthopedics, for instance, I can just filter it down to open access titles that are published in orthopedics and sports medicine, for example. So we can see that Scopus ranks the journals in order of site score, which is Scopus's assigned metric for ranking journals. And you can read more about the site score methodology by clicking here, and it'll tell you how that's calculated. But it's just another impact metric that Elsevier use. It also tells you the number of citations received in a particular journal over a particular time frame. And again, you can download this list again and export it to reference management. So again, you make that list of journals, and that can be a good way of quickly generating that list. One other feature that I thought might be useful to show you quickly, and I've not seen in any other database other than Scopus, is that you can search for funding sponsors. So if I click the title down here, so I can search for a funding sponsor, for example. So I need to put the curly brackets in to search for a phrase. So if I pop health and care research in, for example, it's going to give me a list of papers that were funded by Health and Care Research Wales. So if you're thinking about submitting a bid for funding, it might be useful to have a little search for that funding sponsor and see where previous successful applicants have published their work. But as I say, that's a very quick demonstration of Scopus, and Alison Wheatman will be going into more detail about that this afternoon. So I'll just take us back to the slide deck. And I'm happy to stay on and answer any questions if anybody has any. But we'll be sending around the useful resources list as well after this. So all the links that I've mentioned in the session, you'll have those available